But the fact that I think fundamentally the people who are building the housing can't live in the places that they're building is a huge problem. And that's why we feel really stuck. If we made housing easier to build, we would get better housing. I really do believe that. I think the level of architecture and development skill in this country is pretty high. And what really stymies their ability to do quality work is the process itself. And so if you let people cook a little bit more, I think we get good work.
Most modern.
All right, welcome to another Mopo at Home. It's just me, Libo, and Alex today. We are going over a very important topic that we touch on from time to time as we have different guests. But the main question Alex is here to help us answer today is, why is affordable housing so unaffordable? So where should we start?
It's a very complicated situation, Libo, but in general, affordable housing, especially in America, is really unaffordable because there are a ton of costs associated with providing housing. And if you think about housing as a product, it's one of the most capital and cost intensive products that we have in our lives. If you buy a home, it's probably the most expensive purchase you're ever going to make in your life. And to be honest, it's just getting harder and harder to actually build new housing.
So why is it so hard?
I think what we'd like to do is break it down a little bit for the average listener to understand exactly all the costs that go into housing. And I'm coming at this from the American perspective where I do most of my work. And my work is not just architecture, but it's also the development side. So we see the pro forma and we understand all the financial implications of some of these projects. Now, in America, housing is basically provided by the private sector. In other countries, like in Singapore or in parts of Western Europe, it is actually produced, developed, and maintained by the public sector. But that's something that America has moved away from, largely because of some of the failures of that model back in the 60s and 70s, but also with in a general belief that the private sector is more nimble and can move faster. And so when we're talking about affordable housing in America, what we're actually talking about is a public-private partnership between private sector housing developers and public entities which are providing financial subsidy to this process. Now, that in and of itself is a complication. Usually, if you want to go make a market rate project, you just go acquire the land, you raise the money yourself, and you get building. Now, when you're dealing with affordable housing, and what we mean by affordable housing is usually income restricted based on how much money you make relative to the area median income, the AMI, it becomes a lot more complicated.
Let's start at the pro forma. I don't know if a lot of people know what a pro forma is, but it's kind of this building before it becomes a building. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the pro forma is, what are the inputs and outputs, and how does that tell us whether a project should be built?
Pro forma is basically the financial structure of any deal. And in real estate, you're talking about building the project. So what you do is you go model. What I mean by model is you basically make a spreadsheet. You add up, you multiply, you divide all your costs and your perceived profits or your perceived revenue from the project. And you have to see, if we do this project, is it going to be financially viable? And so that's how you basically calculate that before you get into the project itself.
What are some of the inputs into it? What are the major cost buckets?
Well, there's basically three major cost buckets. First is land acquisition. Unless you own the land already, you need to have a piece of land to buy, to purchase, and to build on. And usually that requires a lot of money. The second is the hard cost. Hard cost is basically any cost that is associated with constructing something, making a physical object. So that's construction, that's site work, that's any sort of renovation or remediation that you need to do to the site. And then finally, soft cost. Again, anything that is not hard, that is not physical, but includes services like architecture fees, permitting, and financing as well. So those three buckets are the main things that you model in a pro forma. And I can break those down a little bit further, but they vary drastically, and there's subcomponents in each of them.
These are kind of the costs, right? But on the other side, there's financing. Like, we have to pay for the project somehow. And a lot of it's not the developer coming out of their own pocket. So can you talk about the financing end a little bit?
Yeah, I think financing needs to be highlighted as not cash. Financing means you're usually leveraging, you're taking out debt, you're getting investment from somebody, whether it's a federal government, a private bank, or private individuals to help pay for your project. And so the developer, a lot of people think, is this cash-rich individual who can just drop down money and do whatever they want. Usually developers are extremely leveraged, and they're going to other sources of money and funding to finance their projects. And that's a huge part of, I think, the role of the developer, basically assembling the financial team that is going to produce the work.
both of these elements kind of go into the production of building, but then on the other side, once the building is built, there's kind of income coming in, right? For a rental residential, there's like rent coming in, for offices, for industrial. So how does that factor into the?
Well, generally speaking, what you want your performer to do is for your eventual financial outcome to exceed your financial input, meaning you will make money on the project. And that's why in America, it's so market driven. It's basically no one's going to do a project that doesn't make financial sense. And like I just said, it's not just because you don't have one potentially greedy individual, it's a bunch of individuals who are using real estate to actually make a financial gain. And this is in direct competition with the financial markets, with the capital markets, with other sources and forms of investment that you could park your money in to make money down the line. You mentioned there's rental. Rental becomes ongoing cash flow that you can underwrite against. You might actually just want to sell the project and get out of the project in a sort of lump sum, single windfall. There's other models as well, but those are the two primary versions that we're looking at in real estate these days.
So I guess maybe let's use a market rate, a multifamily as an example. How does building, so a regular market rate versus building an affordable housing, if the building is the same, how do they differ from a pro forma perspective?
To be honest, the pro formas are fairly similar. I think potentially when we're dealing with affordable housing, you're generally dealing with rental. You're not building to sell. So that's one difference, the exit strategy. You might sell the entire building down the line, but you have to lease it up first and stabilize it. But generally, the inputs are pretty much the same. Obviously, costs are restricted in affordable housing. So the types and quality of materials that you use is going to be different from a market rate, especially a luxury market rate project. But there aren't a lot of major financially structurally different elements in these pro formas. The main difference is your source of funding. And in affordable housing projects in America, a large portion of your funding comes from some sort of public subsidy, whether it be grants, tax credits, or something of the like.
Is this what you're talking about when you say like affordable housing in America is a public-private partnership?
Yeah, exactly. I think basically the government is not the one who is going out to do the development work. What I'm saying, bringing all the money together, hiring the architect, making sure you get all the permits, but they are really heavily involved in subsidizing. And I think that for the past generation or so, that has been the status quo. And I honestly don't see that changing very much lately.
So what's different to a project if you're getting funding from the government?
Well, the main difference is your timeline is drastically different. If I have an established relationship with a lender, whether it be a bank, I have a large line of credit, or an individual investor, I can walk up to them and say, hey, write me a check right now and let's do this project. Subsidy, you're actually competing with all these other projects that are out there, and you have to go through this round of applications, which are at a fairly regular schedule. They happen several times throughout the year, but it's not something that you can just initiate right away. It's going to take time for you to actually get the results back. And in a lot of cases right now, because affordable housing is so competitive, a lot of times you're actually not going to get the funding. And so you have to keep on going and trying and applying again.
But what are the time spans we're talking about? Like, what's the difference?
In general, the time spans for affordable housing grants are usually there's several rounds of grants and applications for tax credits and whatnot every several months. And those vary. You could be getting federal funding, you could be getting state funding, you could be getting local funding. And you're probably, if you're trying to develop an affordable housing project, you're going for all of those things. You're trying to build up layers of this funding, and you're just kind of go for as much as possible. And the other thing that actually affects the project itself is sometimes these funding sources have requirements attached to them. Say, for instance, you're going for farmer housing funding. Then you need to allocate a certain proportion of your project to farmers, versus if it were a market rate project, you wouldn't have that restriction. Other restrictions include the type of labor you use, so prevailing wage or union labor. And so that has a direct impact into your pro forma as well. So what the funding does is it adheres certain restrictions and requirements to your project that don't necessarily make it a worse project, but means that there is a little bit more onerousness and there's less freedom with what you can actually do with the real estate product down the line.
With all these timestamps, all these applications, with all these strings attached, what's the incentive for someone to go into affordable housing?
Well, the primary incentive is that you get free money, essentially, and you don't have to rely on individual sources for that, private sources, to which you'll have to pay return. The government's return is basically that you're building housing for society. That's their value. And in that sense, it's quite altruistic. They're not looking for a major financial return. So if you don't have connections to large capital resources, it's a great way to get into it. That being said, you also have to have a track record to even apply for a lot of these sources. So that's starting to loosen up because the government and a lot of jurisdictions are realizing that we do need to incentivize affordable housing. And therefore, we do need to allow for a younger tier, a less experienced tier of developer to actually get into these projects as well.
So we covered a little bit about what's the difference, where the funding comes from. But what we haven't really talked about is as we all know, the rapid rise in costs in the recent years. Like, how has this changed maybe the dynamic or the urgency of some of these grants?
Well, I would say the most important thing right now is the increase in interest rates. Now, the Fed just cut interest rates by 25 bips a month or so ago, but it's down from a pretty high level compared to pre-COVID. So let's just use simple math, for instance. Right after COVID, the interest rate was about 3%. The government wanted to stimulate the economy. They wanted to make sure that you could get access to capital because people weren't spending in stores and going out. But then that led to rapid inflation. And then somewhere around 2022, 2023, the interest rates start to rise. So if you bought your home in 21, you have a pretty good interest rate. If you bought your home a year or 18 months later, you have a much higher interest rate. And right now we're looking at around 6%. So in about 2 to 3 years, the interest rate doubled. And just for some context, if you are developing a project and you've taken out a $30 million loan, which is probably pretty average for a medium scale project in any major metropolitan area, the interest that you would pay on a 3% APR loan for 1 year on that loan would be about $900,000 to $1 million. Now, if you double that, you're paying another $900,000 to $1 million for the same thing, just to hold the loan for an extra year. So if you add that over the lifespan of an entire loan product or over a building, that's substantial increases. That's $30+ million in additional costs that you're going to have to absorb. And of course, where does that go? It generally goes to the consumer. So this is something that's affected both market rate and affordable housing. What that's done is basically make a lot of market rate projects really hard to build because developers can't swallow that cost, that increase. And so they're actually looking more and more towards affordable housing subsidy to make sure that their projects can pencil, basically give them a boost so that they can make the projects work out financially.
Is this what you were talking about when you mentioned that affordable housing is really competitive?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a LinkedIn post yesterday basically saying that you can't build market rate in LA. And all these market rate developers are rushing to try to find ways to get affordable housing subsidy. That means there's an increase in demand for that subsidy. And there's more and more people applying for these projects. That being said, I think the government is also responding to that, knowing that that's an important thing that they have to fund. So we do hope to see actually an increase in the amount of subsidy that's out there. That usually is slower than the market is to actually react to.
So when you say like you can't build market rate in LA and everyone's rushing to build affordable, does that create a scenario eventually where you can only build affordable housing?
To be honest, right now, I think that the only product you could build in most jurisdictions is government subsidized affordable housing. I think it's really difficult unless you have a really preferred interest rate on a loan or you have cash basically to build some sort of market rate product at the moment. Now, the hope in general is that those interest rates will go down and that will unlock a lot more capacity in general within the market. Also on the consumer side to actually go out and buy a home. But that's just something that we don't have any control over.
Do you see this situation changing? Like you mentioned earlier that the Fed did cut the interest rate a little bit. Is this something that we can balance our way out of, or are we stuck in this situation for maybe another 5 to 10 years?
Well, it would be great if we could combat rising interest rates with lower cost of construction. But unfortunately, that's just not how things work. The double whammy is basically while interest rates were going up, all other physical materials were also going up. All experiences going to the grocery store and chicken and eggs cost more. Guess what? Wood costs more. Nails cost more. Labor costs more. All of that is going up. So inflation is also really affecting housing procurement in general. And that's why I was talking about the hard costs. A hard cost usually is half to maybe even 2/3 of your total development costs, TDC. And when those go up, that also increases the cost of housing. Basically, what this does is it just puts more strain and more risk on any project. So most developers are more and more risk averse. They're not willing to try things just because the financial return is much more in peril than it was before. And just for some context, I think pre-COVID, you could expect in really expensive jurisdictions like San Francisco and New York, the two most expensive places to build in America, probably on average about $400 to $420 per square foot to build in those places. Now it's over $500. So that's a substantial 20 10-ish% increase in construction costs, which directly goes to your bottom line.
So last time we did a mobile at home, we talked about construction constipation. And it seems like not only the cost of capital, but also the cost of construction, both are rising to a point where it's incredibly hard for us to even think about building something. Do you see one of those two things changing?
Well, this is the problem. Housing is a wicked challenge because as you get less and less housing, cost of everything else goes higher and higher. Like in California, it's not uncommon to have contractors commuting from Nevada where they can buy land much cheaper, they can live much more cheaply, and then come into California and basically make a lot of money because they're in a very high cost environment. Now, you have to add on to the fact that they have to drive several hours each way. Sometimes they rent hotels while they're doing their projects in California. But the fact that I think fundamentally the people who are building the housing can't live in the places that they're building is a huge problem. And that's why we feel really stuck.
Each week on Most Modern, we bring you another conversation and a different perspective on the built environment. If you enjoy these conversations as much as we do, please consider subscribing to the show. It'll help us reach more listeners like you.
So in terms of what we're going to do to get out of this, I think we have to put our head down and really push. We have to really try new and innovative ways to do these projects essentially, but also recognize that a lot of people aren't really incentivized to put their money in real estate at the moment. It's really challenging. And so I think there needs to be some sort of, again, public-private partnership between the government and private actors to try to unstuck our situation and get the ball moving again.
So is the government doing enough right now? Like, is the current programs, is the current way of, funding these projects working?
Well, actually, the Trump administration in the big beautiful bill has increased the amount of funding going to affordable housing. And I think that's really interesting from a political perspective because affordable housing is not a red or blue issue. There are people in California who don't have a place to live, just like there are people in Mississippi who don't have a place to live. Actually, politically, it's pretty smart because you appeal to a lot of different constituents and it's a nonpartisan issue. It's not something that I think most people argue that housing shouldn't be something that everybody's entitled to. And that's at the federal level. And I think, of course, the federal government can always do more to reallocate money towards housing as opposed to other initiatives. But that's a very complicated discussion. On the local level, what I see a lot of jurisdictions doing, especially those that really are feeling the pain of that construction constipation or the lack of housing in their environment, is they're really trying to address regulation. This is the other factor that comes into play with affordable housing and housing in general, any construction in general, is permitting. How do you incentivize people to actually build in places where they previously weren't incentivized to build? Whether that's because of zoning prohibiting certain types of uses or certain sizes of buildings in places, or if it's because you don't have the right infrastructure, you don't have the schools, you don't have this sort of thing, or if it's also about the permitting process itself and limiting the ability for certain individuals to stymie the production of housing. Now, if you go back to what I was talking about finances, the cost of just sitting there and doing nothing in dollars and cents can be extremely high. And this is something I think that either NIMBYs do know and they're not willing to admit, or they don't know and they're being ignorant about. If you go and you say, I don't like this project because this, that, and the other, please go back and fix it and change it, that's going to add a lot of cost to the project itself. And the people who have to pay for it are the people who end up living in those places. This idea of discretionary review and discretionary approval in America has really gotten us into this situation. Basically, for a long time, the individual was able to say, I don't care if the project works. I don't care if some people like it. If I don't like it, we're not doing it. And that put a huge asymmetry on the ability to actually produce projects. I think there's a lot of distrust in America between individuals and developers, and there's a history of vicious development in a lot of places, so it's understandable. But at the same time, I would say a lot of developers are actually just trying to earn a good living. They're just trying to actually improve their community, and stymieing that effort can be really demoralizing and really slow down the process, which leads us to where we are right now. I wish a few more people would not necessarily take fault for it or take the fall, but understand their role when they show up to a community meeting about what the implications are if they stand up and say no.
So you're a developer. How has some of these factors impacted projects that you've worked?
Well, I would say it just makes everything a lot slower and less predictable. And that's the hardest part about development, the risk and the lack of predictability. Of course, you go into any investment endeavor and there's always a chance that you're going to lose money or it's not going to work out. And that's the that's the game we play essentially. But what does get really frustrating is when you have everything figured out, you have everything lined up, and you have everything ready to go, you have approval from the majority of people, and somebody comes in and throws a wrench in your cogs, and everything has to slow down because of one person. I haven't experienced it that much, but I have friends who have experienced that much, and it makes people really gun shy, and it also erodes trust because a lot of times people are trying to do something good. Minku has talked about his project working in Boston, in Roxbury, and how there's so much goodwill in that project, and yet a few people just don't like it, and they want to take, I guess, their frustrations out on the system. That sort of thing is just not healthy. I find it particularly un-American, in fact.
So you mentioned things like permitting, things that local governments are trying to speed up the process of getting these projects approved, getting these projects built. Can you maybe walk us through, in your mind, a good example of some local rule change that made it faster and easier to get things built?
Yeah, I think a lot of jurisdictions should start to institute some sort of shot clock when it comes to permitting, meaning you put your application in and you can track how long it's going to take. For a long time, you put it in and you never know. So say, for instance, we wanted to apply for college, and it's like, okay, apply by December 15th and we'll let you know at some point. Do you think you would apply for college at that point if you don't know if you're going to be admitted in April or next April or the year after? Sort of what it's like with housing and building in general. And in this case, you have a lot more money going in. And like I said, every minute that you're waiting is another cost that you have to add to your pro forma because you're usually paying financing on that. Now, one way around that is if you own the land outright already, that's really helpful. And one thing that we're increasingly doing is we're looking for seller financing. So if we're going to buy land, can we also bring the seller in, maybe not pay them as much up front, but basically give them a little bit more if they hold on to it, take a portion of the project. Basically, it's like taking an equity stake in the project, and then help us basically get that through, understanding the unpredictability of the market and permitting. But I would say jurisdictions really should focus on that permitting process, really revamp their physical systems, basically what it's like to actually go in and submit a permit. Also improve your digital infrastructure. Make sure that it's easy, accessible. Make sure it's something that you encourage people to do rather than putting up a bunch of short barriers and making it really cumbersome to actually do the work.
This seems like a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of applications, a lot of things to track, a lot of dates, a lot of constraints, restrictions. Is building an affordable project much harder and much more complex than building a market rate?
It's very different, I would say. In some ways, it is harder because your costs and your timelines are much more restrictive. And like I said, there might be other stipulations that you have to adhere to. In other ways, it's easier because there are more diversified ways that you can get funding. Like I said, you can basically get free money in a lot of cases to do this project if you partner with the government. So I would say it's hard. On the design side, your costs definitely do show up. You want to get the best AC unit, you're not going to get it. You want to get the nicest finishes and materials, unfortunately, you're not going to get it. I think that if people also understood that if we made housing easier to build, we would get better housing. I really do believe that. I think the level of architecture and development skill in this country is pretty high. And what really stymies their ability to do quality work is the process itself. And so if you let people cook a little bit more, I think we'd get good work. You would get some bad projects as well, but that's no different from any other point in time or in any other country, to be honest.
So if you had a magic wand and you could magically reconfigure, change a system, maybe change some of the levers that we talked about that make it hard to build housing, like what would you do to wave away our affordable housing?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing would be to change interest rates, but that seems almost like you'd need to be even greater than God to fix that. To be honest, actually, I would really change the amount of awareness and education around housing and development in the built environment. I think if community members and the average individual knew what it took to actually build housing and what the implications were if we could build well, I think we would have a totally different attitude towards it in America. Now, part of it is just the simple culture of looking at housing as a financial commodity rather than a public infrastructure. But I do think that's sort of changing a little bit. But like I said, I don't think most people understand just the sheer complexity and the sheer costs that are involved and they're at risk when you go into housing, and how the smoother that process can be from the government side or from the public side when it comes to approvals, the more housing we can have. And, that would fix this wicked challenge that I introduced at the beginning. If we have more housing, it'll be easier to build more housing. And I think that's pretty good.
So if there's like one piece of learning that you could leave listeners with that helps them see this issue from a better perspective,
I think it's to understand that sometimes progress is slow and sometimes things don't happen right away. But The worst thing you can do is be inconsistent with how you approach things. And if we could be a little bit more consistent, a little bit more principled with how we build housing and how we procure housing and how we approve it, design it, all sorts of things like that, we can then absorb shocks to the system like a pandemic or increased interest rates. This is America. People do want to bring their money here. People do want to live here. But if we don't provide the places to actually live, it's going to falter. And I think the fundamental problem, which is becoming more and more dire, I don't want to leave on a bad note, but the moment people can't afford to live in a country is when things really do start to fall apart. We're starting to see it in a lot of different places. America's housing crisis is pretty bad, but so is Canada's, so is the UK's, so is New Zealand. There are examples from around the world of what not to do, but also really good examples of what to do. And I think that's something we like to feature on the show. You know, we've had Yoni talk about the social issues of not having enough housing. We've had Jeremy McLeod talk about how in Australia they're able to get around it through certain mechanisms. Every place has their own problems and their own culture and their own unique solution to things. But I think simply saying no or getting upset is hard. And what I would say, and it's like a principle that I'm trying to employ in general, is try to assume positive intent and try to work with people rather than raising your fist and getting mad at the situation because you don't like change.
I think with that, thank you, Alex, for another educational episode of Mope at Home. And I hope our listeners enjoyed.
Yeah, thank you, Libo. It's really fun to actually talk about this stuff. It's complicated, but it's interesting and it's also really important.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next week on another episode.